dividends, if you're lucky, with all your investment being at risk, when you can make a 3,000% return with no risk, but only requires overcoming the Willie Lynch syndrome and cognitive dissonance through the renewing of your minds. It's like the son who killed his parents when they were asleep. Real story. Because he was spoiled and was never taught personal responsibility. So on this one occasion, because there were countless others, he wanted to borrow more money because he just crashed another car due to his irresponsible behavior. The parents refused this time and told him to get a job and work it out for himself. All of a sudden, they wanted him to grow up and be responsible, something they never taught him while growing up. Mind you, he wanted more money that he never earned himself and never paid back, while he refused to listen and learn. Now he is on death row and has no choice but to listen. These parents wanted to give him everything they never had when they were growing up. But because they failed this child with a proper upbringing, thinking that giving him everything they never had without requiring him to work for it was the proper thing to do, they too ended up on death row, just not the way they expected. Of course, this scenario ends up in different ways, with the parents fearing the child. The decisions we make about taking responsibility and money puts us on death row, leading to a life of worries, frustration, poverty, and despair. Here's another story I call the poverty mindset. It's also like being thirsty, and when you go to the well to draw water for the family, but you don't have anything to put the water in, and your family doesn't understand why you didn't bring any water back, when there is plenty of water all around. Now the whole family goes to the lake to get a drink, and on their knees and hands and knees and with their neighbors who show up for water doing the same thing. By the way, they all have wells in their yards, but they have nothing to put the water in. There are a few merchants by the lake selling sturdy buckets with a dolly to even roll the water back home in. Then there are the imitators and scammers around the lake who have buckets made of cardboard, but they have hip-hop artists and strobe lights promoting these cardboard buckets, which even cost more. They travel home and all the water is lost on the journey, but they don't have the mental ability to understand what just happened. This is the same thing in the black community, where we spend all our money in other neighborhoods and don't have enough to invest in our own communities. It is easier to learn the principles of wealth creation than trying to outsmart the hustler and his minion, the credit repair pimp, in order to get a high credit score, which is, by the way, an oppressive racist system, if you haven't figured it out. You want a good credit score to buy a house when you don't make enough to make the payments without being house poor. It's a predatory, capitalist process being perpetrated against the dark mind, which is ignorance. So, remaining stupid is a choice whose indoctrination starts at a young age and is being passed on generation after generation because they don't believe education is important, which follows them into adulthood. I had one older gentleman tell me that education was a scam. The young children by the lake grow up doing the same thing as their parents. They go home and talk to each other and the neighbors about who performed at the lake. They expect their buckets to collapse, and when some tells them they have a better bucket that could change their lives, their eyes roll to the back of their heads in disbelief. It must be a scam, they tell each other. How can you master the principles and strategies of wealth creation and preservation, learning how to attach the horse to the cart properly? Putting the horse in front of the cart is something that must be taught and learned in order to move forward to your destination. Being able to fill your buckets with water will make you more productive and wealthier than your neighbors at first, until they began to see you prosper. This neighbor became extremely wealthy because he was the first in the community to start his own magic bucket franchise. He still had to trick his neighbors to get their business by calling it a magic bucket, because they saw how more water changed his life. How did this neighbor change his cognitive dissonance, which was his ability to listen to new information from a person at the lake who was selling these buckets that he was convinced had magical properties? Well, you can't change the thinking process all at once, but he did listen enough to get the point, enough to change his life. He had enough water to quench his and his family's thirst, and enough excess water to irrigate his crops and raise healthy animals he had enough left over to sell to his neighbors, which supplemented his magic bucket sales. I want to take you higher. Will you allow me to do that? You must want to take charge of your financial life in order to redefine your collective reality. What does this mean? It means the renewing of your mind. Credit is a system of the oppressor, and is using credit repair just to go into further debt is a symptom of the oppressed and impoverished mind. Learn how to create wealth in order to be truly free. It is actually a mathematical formula, but since most of you failed in middle school, you can't see it. It's called critical thinking and cost-benefit analysis. Weigh the cost of the buckets and the benefits of each. The metal bucket with a dolly or the cardboard bucket with no way to carry the water. It's a choice. Let me ask you something else. We all know that the current social spending bill in Congress is against free community college for all, but let's be real. This would only be pandering to the same status quo. There's a tremendous need to break out of this mold and begin to look at economic reality from a different perspective, of creating a different approach that addresses our specific social, political, and economic needs. But first, we need to understand that such an approach is not only necessary, but how can we achieve such a result and start moving into that direction? This requires being able to step back and see things the way they really are and figure out a new strategy which is superior to what we have become accustomed, because it appears to be the only show in town. But is it? It's a mathematical formula of unity, power through unity. A different approach that will not only strengthen individuals and families while pulling many, if not all, out of poverty and improve American competitiveness. The dominant culture does not possess the mental acuity to understand this fine point, which is why this country is losing ground. Their only response to a changing world is prison, punishment, sanctions, and a military response. This myopic, short-sighted approach has gotten us to where we are now. If you recall your history, the U.S. and Europe was at one time with Japan, an occupying force in China, ripping that nation apart with addicting the population to drugs in order to fund their empires while stealing their resources. The same old strategy of kill, steal, and destroy. The habits of a primal mind, which our children and many of our youth have adopted now in our inner cities, causing the escalation of crime and death. China has over the years, through a change in mindset, strategy, and leadership, managed to pull that country and people together and now managed to lead the world because the European community underestimated them as individuals. Their leadership made a commitment as a nation to forge a new nation that refuses to continue to be marginalized and ostracized as a nation. As a nation within a nation, do we need a dictatorship which would force us to change direction and begin looking at reality from a different perspective? Or can we make a personal choice among ourselves to lead? Come to think of it, this is what the U.S. and Europe is attempting to do by breaking the spirits of its citizens with these forced vaccinations and homeland security and build a nation like the Chinese. But they got it all wrong because the U.S. and Europe has already sold itself to China and underestimated China's desire to lead the world and not be a second-class nation and the footstool of the West. You may believe that race doesn't matter, and if we lived in a perfect society, you would be right. But as a noted black scholar has pointed out to us over the years, race is a team sport, and we need to act accordingly and move in the same direction to be on the same page. This is that time in history that we must come together and start moving toward a world where race should not matter. But this is something that must be fought hard to achieve, because such a realization would not be handed over to you through voting and marching, but only through a position of strength. What would you do if you were elected president and your platform was to lift the poor out of poverty, which includes a program of reparations funding in disguise, because you realize that this is the only way that we could compete again as a nation? Before I go on, let me set the stage. In America, other than the three branches of government that the Constitution calls for, with each branch having its own administration that adds to its dysfunctional apparatus, these administrations are permanent and not subject to voter approval. In theory, there is supposed to be a balance of power to avoid corruption. A check and balance, if you will, to balance powers which are the legislative branch, which makes laws, Congress, comprised of the House of Representatives and Senate. Then there's the executive branch, carries out the laws, the president, vice president, cabinet, and most federal agencies. Then there's the judicial branch that evaluates laws, the Supreme Court and other courts. And these powers should be balanced. It calls it balance. So one branch is not more powerful than the other. Then there is the State Department within the executive branch. The Department of State is the lead U.S. foreign affairs agency, and the Secretary of State is the President's principal foreign policy advisor. This is the tail that wags the dog. There is a permanent government and a transitional government, which is ingrained in the concept of imperialism and manifest destiny, which means in their minds they are inherently superior, and we will conquer you by any means necessary. Now China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are threatening this mindset, and Europeans are not only at a loss of what to do, but they are in panic mode and in a state of shock, similar to the condition of Black Americans, as a result of the Willie Lynch syndrome and cognitive dissonance, not knowing what should be done or even how it should be done because the concept and situation has become so overwhelming. So, how do we change this dynamic? One bite at a time. So if you're elected president, realizing that your power as a transitional leader is limited, and you're not the only one in charge. However, you realize that this country needs to overcome its psychosis and needs Black America to evolve, as well as all its poor and disenfranchised citizens that have been excluded and marginalized from society.